The morning sun had barely touched the rooftops of the small town when she returned, walking with the same quiet grace she had always carried. No one had seen her for nearly a year, and when she disappeared, most had assumed she'd gone off to live a quiet life elsewhere. She had always been a simple woman, known more for her silence than her words, for her habit of standing in the background rather than at the center of attention. But as she stepped back into the familiar streets, there was something different about her. She carried a long heavy case strapped to her back, its black frame gleaming in the light. Few recognized it for what it was, but those who did froze in their tracks. The M2010 sniper rifle was not a weapon that belonged in the hands of ordinary people, and certainly not in the hands of the woman they had always dismissed as simple, harmless, and unremarkable. Whispers traveled fast in the market square. Children paused in their games, vendors looked up from their stalls, and the old men who usually spent mornings gossiping over tea fell silent. The woman ignored them all, her steps steady, her eyes locked on some unseen point ahead. She walked with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she carried, exactly why she had come back, and exactly what she was going to do. A few men tried to approach her, more curious than cautious. They asked where she had been, what she was carrying, and whether she was in trouble. She gave them nothing, not even a glance. It was the same silence she had always worn like armor, but now that silence felt heavier, dangerous even. By the time she reached the edge of town, the rumors had already begun to spread. Some said she had joined the military. Others claimed she had been working for mercenaries. A few whispered about vengeance, about the family she had lost years ago in an attack that no one had ever fully understood. Whatever the truth was, it didn't matter, because soon they would all witness what she had become. She stopped at a hill overlooking the valley. From there, the whole town could be seen along with the roads that led in and out. She knelt down slowly, set the case on the ground, and opened it. The steel latches snapped free with a sharp click that carried on the breeze, and inside lay the rifle in all its precision-built perfection. She ran her hands across it like someone greeting an old friend, her fingers steady, almost reverent. Every movement she made was deliberate, practiced. She slid the barrel into place, secured the scope, and adjusted the stock. Not once did her eyes drift, not once did she hesitate. By the time the rifle was assembled, she was no longer just the woman they thought they knew. She was something else entirely, something trained, dangerous, and utterly calm. She checked the wind with a small strip of cloth, adjusted the scope accordingly, then settled into position, lying flat against the earth. The silence of the morning stretched around her, broken only by the slow rhythm of her breathing. Down in the valley, a convoy of black vehicles appeared, kicking up dust as they sped along the dirt road toward town. The townsfolk who had followed her gaze now understood. These were not friendly faces. They were men who had terrorized the region for months, armed raiders, smugglers, and killers who took what they wanted and left destruction behind. The town had lived in fear of their return, but no one had dared to fight them. No one until now. As the vehicles drew closer, the woman adjusted her position, her cheek pressing gently against the rifle stock. Through the scope, the world narrowed to a single line of sight, a single target. Her finger rested on the trigger, not tense but ready, waiting for the precise moment. The lead vehicle entered range. She slowed her breathing, exhaled, and squeezed. The shot cracked through the morning air, echoing off the hills. A heartbeat later, the windshield of the first truck shattered, the driver slumped forward, and the vehicle swerved violently, flipping onto its side in a storm of dust and twisted metal. The others screeched to a halt, chaos erupting instantly. Men jumped out with rifles, shouting orders, firing blindly into the hills. None of them knew exactly where the shot had come from, but panic already spread through their ranks. She stayed calm, adjusted slightly, and fired again. Another man dropped. Then another. Her movements were smooth, efficient, merciless. For years, the town had seen her as a quiet figure who blended into the background, someone incapable of standing against the violence that haunted their lives. Now, in a matter of minutes, she shattered that illusion completely. Every shot she fired carried with it the truth they had ignored. She was no ordinary woman. She was precise, deadly, and unyielding. The townsfolk watched from a distance, frozen between awe and disbelief. This was not the woman they thought they knew, and yet it was. She had always been there among them, living quietly, carrying her grief alone. Now they finally saw what that grief had forged her into. And as the last of the raiders fell, silence settled over the valley once more, heavier than before. She lowered the rifle, stood, and looked down at the chaos she had wrought. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply slung the rifle back over her shoulder and began walking again, leaving the wreckage behind her. For her, this was not about glory, nor vengeance, nor recognition. It was simply necessary. She walked back into town with the same calm steadiness that had carried her out, but now the air around her was changed, charged with an energy that the townsfolk could feel pressing against their skin. Whispers erupted in her wake, people stepping aside to let her pass, their eyes wide with awe and fear, children clutching the hands of their mothers as if the simple woman they had once known might suddenly turn her rifle on them. She did not look at them, did not acknowledge the way their voices rose behind her, did not slow her pace. She moved like a shadow with a purpose, her boots leaving soft impressions in the dust as she crossed the square, her shoulders steady beneath the weight of the weapon strapped across her back. At the old stone well in the center of town she stopped, not because she wished to drink or rest, but because she could hear the hum of an approaching engine. Turning her head slightly, she caught sight of a lone motorcycle cresting the ridge, moving fast, dust trailing behind it in a long plume. One of them had survived, and he was coming not just with desperation but with intent. She knew the type, a raider who had learned to crawl out from wreckage and run not away but toward blood. The rider was lean, hard-eyed, his hand gripping the throttle like a man who had nothing left to lose. Slung across his back was a heavy submachine gun, and the moment he roared into town the people scattered, screaming, diving into doorways and behind carts. He stood on the pegs of his bike, firing in wild arcs as he entered the square, bullets snapping past wooden beams, shattering glass, sparking against stone. The woman did not flinch. In one smooth motion she swung the M2010 off her shoulder, dropped to one knee, and let the rifle rest against her arm. She did not have time for the careful calculations of wind and distance as she had before, but her instincts were honed to something sharper than calculation, something that guided her with ruthless precision. Fired once, the crack of the rifle splitting the air, and the rider's shoulder exploded backward, spinning him off balance. The motorcycle wobbled, tires screeching as it skidded across the square. He tumbled hard, rolled, and staggered to his feet with blood soaking his arm, still clutching the submachine gun. With a roar of rage he opened fire again, bullets chewing up the cobblestones as he limped forward. The people hid, but they watched too, peering through cracks and slats, unable to tear their eyes away from the confrontation unfolding in their midst. The woman chambered another round, her movements calm even as shards of stone flew around her. She took aim, her breath slow and steady, and fired again. This time the bullet tore through his leg and he went down on one knee, snarling like a wounded animal. But still he raised the gun, still he tried to fire. Her third shot ended it, clean and final, snapping his head back and leaving him crumpled on the ground, his weapon slipping from lifeless fingers. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before, broken only by the ringing echo of the last shot. Slowly the people emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale and stunned. No one dared speak to her. No one dared ask questions. They simply watched as she stood, reloaded her rifle with mechanical calm, and slung it over her shoulder again. For a long moment she remained there in the square, her eyes scanning the horizon, her body still tense as if she expected more to come. Then, as if deciding that the danger had passed, she turned and walked toward the outskirts of town once more. But now the whispers had shifted. The fear remained, but layered beneath it was something else, something that tasted of respect, of reluctant admiration. They had lived for too long under the shadow of raiders and criminals, too long in fear of men with guns who thought themselves untouchable. Now they had seen one woman stand against them, not with hesitation or plea, but with ruthless precision and unwavering resolve. Still, none of them truly understood her. They did not know where she had gone during that year of absence, did not know who had taught her to wield such a weapon, did not know what fire had burned so hot inside her that it turned silence into steel. But they knew enough to realize this was no accident. She had not stumbled upon the rifle by chance, nor had she returned to town by coincidence. Every movement she made spoke of intent, of someone following a path only she could see. As night fell down, lanterns flickered to life in the windows, and the people whispered her name like a legend in the making. But she sat alone at the edge of the valley, rifle across her lap, her eyes reflecting the distant stars. For her the day was not over. This was only the beginning. The night stretched long and heavy over the valley, the kind of darkness that carried weight, pressing against the earth with silence so complete it felt unnatural. She sat there on the ridge with the rifle across her knees, her eyes fixed on the horizon though there was nothing yet to see. The town behind her had gone quiet after the chaos, though flickers of lanterns still burned in windows where people whispered about her, about what she had done, about what it meant for their future. To them she was already something more than flesh and bone, already becoming a story to tell their children, but to herself she was only a woman carrying a burden too deep to speak aloud. Her hands moved over the weapon with the same care one might use on an instrument of prayer, wiping dust from the scope, checking the magazine, feeling the solid weight that had become both shield and chain. She did not rest because she knew men like the one she had struck down never came alone. The one she had killed today would be missed by others, and those others would come, not with reality but with. And she waited because she wanted them to come. In the distance, long after midnight, the sound began. The low growl of engines, not one or two but many, moving together in a formation too deliberate to be chance. The faint glow of headlights appeared along the far road, scattered at first and then gathering into a steady march of light. She exhaled slowly, rising to her feet, and swung the rifle across her back. The town would be asleep, unprepared for what was approaching, and though part of her wanted to face them here on the ridge, she knew the battle would mean nothing if those people were caught unaware. So she walked back, her boots crunching softly against the dirt, her steps quick and certain. She reached the square and pounded once on the old bell tower door until the caretaker stumbled out, eyes wide with confusion. She told him only one thing: wake them. Then she climbed the steps to the top of the tower, moving with a speed that betrayed none of the exhaustion beginning to gnaw at her body. From the top she could see them clearly now, trucks and bikes, armored with makeshift plating, bristling with men who carried rifles slung casually as though violence were an extension of breathing. There were too many for her alone, but she had never intended to fight alone. Lights flared in windows as people rose and voices of fear filled the air, but fear gave way to action as the truth sank in. The raiders were coming. Some men and women grabbed hunting rifles from their walls, others gathered their children and ran toward cellars, but all eyes turned to the tower where she stood, silhouetted against the moon with the rifle glinting like an answer to their terror. She raised her hand once, a silent command, and they seemed to understand without words. They scattered into positions, some taking cover on rooftops, others blocking alleys with carts. For the first time in years, the town prepared not to hide but to fight. The convoy reached the edge of the valley and slowed, sensing resistance. She lay down behind the stone lip of the tower and set the rifle on its rest, peering through the scope with calm eyes. The first shot cracked out, dropping a gunner from the back of a truck. Shouts erupted, engines roared, and the night exploded into chaos. Bullets tore into walls, glass shattered, screams rose and fell, but from the tower her fire was unrelenting, each shot deliberate, each target falling before they could unleash more destruction. Below, the townsfolk fought with desperate courage, emboldened by her presence. They fired from windows, ambushed from alleys, and though they were not soldiers, the strength of defending their own homes gave them edge enough to endure. She shifted her aim again and again, her breathing even as the rifle cracked and thundered, as bodies fell, as smoke thickened the air. Hours seemed to stretch into moments until at last the survivors of the raiders began to retreat, dragging their wounded, their engines howling as they sped back into the night. The square was left littered with broken glass, bullet holes, and the still forms of both enemies and townsfolk who had paid the price. The silence afterward was suffocating, filled with grief and exhaustion. She rose from the tower, descended slowly and walked among them. Some wept, some stared blankly, some grasped her hands as if she were salvation itself. But she said nothing, offered no comfort, gave no speeches. She only moved among the living and the dead alike, her eyes hard but not unfeeling, her silence a kind of acknowledgement that words could not match. When dawn finally broke, she was already outside the town again, rifle slung across her shoulder, standing alone against the rising light. The people would rebuild, would bury their dead, would tell the story of how a simple woman had led them through the night, but she knew the war was not finished. Somewhere beyond those hills, men were gathering, men who would not forgive what had happened, men who would come again in greater numbers. She was ready. The sun climbed over the horizon with a dull red glow, the kind of light that carried no warmth, only the promise of another day heavy with consequence. The town stirred slowly, voices hushed as people moved through streets marked by broken wood, shattered glass, and blood drying in dark streaks across the cobblestones. The night's battle had taken its toll, yet amidst grief there was also a strange kind of awakening, a realization that they had stood their ground and survived. But the woman did not linger in that fragile dawn. She walked beyond the outskirts, rifle resting against her back, eyes scanning the distance where dust still lingered from the retreat of the raiders. She knew they would not stop, not now. She had cut into the heart of their operation, struck a blow too public and too humiliating to be left unanswered. They would return, and when they did, it would not be in a ragged convoy of desperate marauders but with force organized, deliberate, and far more deadly. She stopped at the ridge, where the valley opened like a scar, and knelt in the dirt. From her pack she drew maps, traced the roads, the ridges, the narrow passes that led into the town. She studied them with the patience of someone who knew that the next move would decide not just her fate but the fate of everyone who still slept behind her. Every path had its strengths, every valley its weakness, but she searched not for escape. Escape had never been an option. She searched for the place where she could turn their numbers into nothing, where her rifle and her silence could break the momentum of an enemy too sure of itself. As she worked, the wind shifted, carrying with it faint sounds from the distance. Vehicles starting, engines revving, voices shouting. They were not far. Her jaw tightened but her hands stayed steady. She folded the maps, slid them back into the pack and rose. There was no time to rest. She moved down the ridge with swift certainty, her boots cutting paths through dry earth, her eyes already calculating angles, distances, lines of sight. She knew where to go, an old canyon east of the town, narrow and winding, its stone walls tall and jagged. She had gone there as a girl to escape, to be unseen, and she remembered every twist of its paths. It was there she would make her stand, not for glory, not for revenge, but because she knew if she waited until they reached the town again, the people would be slaughtered. The canyon was her answer. She reached it by midday, the sun high above, casting thin lines of shadow between the rocks. The place was silent, ancient, its walls marked with scars of storms and centuries. She crouched near a rise that overlooked the main path and settled the rifle into position. Every part of her body aligned with the weapon, her breathing slowing, her heartbeat steadying. She did not have long to wait. Dust rose in the distance, first faint, then thicker, until the sound of engines filled the canyon like thunder rolling between stone walls. Trucks and armored bikes roared into the pass, men shouting above the din, their weapons bristling from the sides. They came with confidence, certain they were hunting prey already broken, blind to the trap they were driving into. Her finger brushed the trigger. The first shot cracked, echoing through the canyon like a roar. The lead driver's skull shattered against the wheel, and the truck veered sideways, slamming into the canyon wall with a scream of twisting metal. Chaos erupted instantly, engines braking, men shouting, weapons firing blindly into cliffs. She shifted, calm as stone, and fired again, dropping a gunner from the back of a bike. Another shot, their numbers meaningless as they funneled into the choke point. Vehicles collided, overturned, men scattered, trying to find cover where none existed. She moved with unyielding precision, chambering round after round, each shot deliberate, each target falling before they could orient. Shouts turned to screams, engines to explosions, the canyon filling with smoke and blood. But still they pressed, still they tried to advance, and her rifle answered each attempt with merciless calm. Hours bled into each other as she fought alone against their tide, until at last the survivors broke, retreating the way they had come, their numbers cut down to a fraction, their bravado turned to terror. The canyon fell silent again, the air heavy with the stench of burning fuel and death. She lowered the rifle, her arms aching, her throat dry, but her gaze never wavered. She knew this was not victory, only a reprieve. For every man she had cut down, another would hear, another would come, drawn not just by revenge now but by the growing legend of the woman with the rifle who had shattered their ranks again and again. She slung the weapon across her back and walked among the wreckage, her boots crunching over shards of glass and splintered steel. She searched the bodies not for loot, not for trophies, but for information. Maps, radios, orders, anything that told her where the true heart of this enemy lay. Among the wreckage she found a satchel, leather-worn, inside it documents scrawled with names and coordinates. She studied them, her eyes narrowing as the lines of their network revealed themselves. This was not just a band of raiders. This was an organized force, larger than anyone in the town had realized, with leaders hidden further east, men who commanded from safety while others bled in their name. She folded the papers and slid them into her pack. She knew then what had to come next. She could not wait for them to keep arriving, wave after wave, bringing death to the valley. She would have to take the fight to them, strike not just at their soldiers but at their leaders, cut the head from the snake before it could coil tighter around everything she still wished to protect. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the canyon, she began her walk east, her figure small against the vastness of the land, yet carrying with her the weight of inevitability, The journey eastward carried her across barren plains where the wind whipped dust into endless spirals and the sky stretched wide and merciless, an empty dome above a landscape stripped of softness. She long ago trained herself to ignore fatigue, her rifle steady on her back, her pack light but sufficient. Each night she built no fire, spoke no words, simply lay in the shadow of rocks with the rifle close and her eyes half closed, listening to the whisper of insects, the howl of distant animals, and the occasional roar of an engine carried faintly across the dark. The documents she had taken from the canyon were etched into her mind, supply lines marked across deserts, coordinates scribbled near outposts, names written with a care that suggested authority. These were not the scrawls of a scattered gang but the ledgers of an organized warlord, a man who had been carving his power quietly into the land while the towns remained blind. She thought of the people she had left behind, the way they had looked at her with awe and fear, and she knew if she did not move forward, they would soon be erased. On the third night she reached the edge of an abandoned mining settlement, its shacks broken, its towers leaning, its grounds scattered with rusting machinery. She entered cautiously, her senses sharpened, every shadow and creak of metal a warning. She had not come this way seeking shelter but intelligence, for the documents had hinted at this place as a waypoint. And sure, men gathered near a fire in the center of the broken camp, armored vehicles parked loosely around them, weapons slung carelessly as they ate and laughed. They were scouts, hardened but undisciplined, perhaps thinking themselves safe in such isolation. She studied them through her scope, counting their numbers, tracing their routines. There were 6 of them, too many to take in close quarters without risk, but too few to pose a true threat to her at range. She lowered the scope and settled into position, letting the night fold around her. One by one, with patient rhythm, she pulled the trigger. Each shot cracked the silence, each man fell before he could rise, their laughter cut short into abrupt stillness. When the last one slumped forward into the dust, the fire hissed and crackled alone. She waited, breath steady, eyes scanning for movement, but none came. Then she descended, her boots silent on the gravel, her figure blending into the skeletal remains of the camp. She searched their packs and vehicles, uncovering more fragments of information. Maps, supply routes, coordinates pointing deeper into the east where a fortress was marked, a place referred to in their crude handwriting as the Iron Nest. That was where she would have to go. She refueled one of their trucks, checked the engine, and drove out before the fire had even burned down to ash, her silhouette swallowed by the horizon once more. The roads grew harsher as she pressed on, canyons splitting the land, bridges broken, dust storms rising without warning. She navigated each obstacle with calm precision, her focus never wavering from the path ahead. And yet in the quiet moments, when the engine droned steady and the night sky glimmered above, memories pressed against her like ghosts. Faces she had lost, voices silenced in the raids that had first pushed her into silence. She remembered her husband, who had stood in the doorway of their home with nothing but a hunting rifle, cut down before her eyes when the raiders came years ago. She remembered her son, a boy of 12, taken by them into the smoke and never seen again. It was in that silence afterward that she had left, not running but learning, vanishing into places no one cared to search, teaching herself to become the weapon she now carried. The M2010 had not come to her by chance. It had been earned through long nights of training, through alliances with men who recognized the fire in her and gave her the tools to turn it into precision. She had never sought to be a savior, but when she returned, she carried all of that with her, and now she carried it toward the Iron Nest. By the 5th day she crested a ridge and saw it in the distance. The fortress rose from the desert like a scar of steel and stone, walls built high with scavenged concrete, towers bristling with spotlights and gun mounts. Around it sprawled a sprawl of tents and vehicles, an entire army encamped under banners of black and red. The size of it struck even her with weight. She could not face this alone, not in the open. But she did not falter. She crouched low, studied the layout through her scope, tracing guard rotations, measuring distances between towers, mapping every vulnerability her eyes could catch. She marked the supply road leading out to the east, watched convoys enter and leave, carrying fuel, food, and ammunition. She knew then that this fortress could not simply be attacked. It would have to be unraveled piece by piece, its lifeblood cut off until it weakened enough to break. She whispered nothing aloud, but her mind settled with certainty. She would bring it down. She stayed hidden on the ridge for 2 days, moving only at night, watching the fortress with the patience of a predator who knows the hunt is not about speed but precision. Through the scope of her rifle she studied every pattern, every mistake the guards made, every gap in the routines of men who thought themselves untouchable. the way they smoked and joked on duty, and she stored each detail as ammunition more deadly than bullets. The iron nest was not simply defended by walls. It was guarded by the belief that no one would dare to strike at it. She intended to shatter that belief piece by piece. On the third night, when the moon was hidden behind clouds, she moved down from the ridge and followed the supply road eastward, her steps silent against the sand. Hours later she found what she was looking for, a convoy of 3 trucks and 2 armored bikes, heavily laden with crates. She lay flat on a rise above the road, her rifle steady. One shot dropped the lead driver, the truck swerving violently as the others braked. Panic erupted, men shouting, rifles firing wildly into the darkness, but the night was her ally. Each time they fired she shifted position, her rifle cracking once, twice, 3 times, each shot cutting another man from the fight until silence returned. She descended quickly, her movements efficient, and searched the trucks. Inside the crates she found fuel, ammunition, and rations meant to keep the fortress alive. Without hesitation she planted explosives she had scavenged from the scouts at the mining camp, set the timers, and walked away as the convoy erupted into flames behind her, the fire blooming high into the sky, visible even from the distant towers of the iron nest. She knew the sight would send waves of unease rippling through the fortress, and unease was the first fracture in their armor. The next day she struck again, this time at a patrol sweeping the outer canyons. She led them into a dead end, her rifle guiding each step of their doom until the last of them fell into the dust. By the end of the week, whispers were spreading through the camps outside the fortress. Men spoke of a ghost in the desert, a single shooter who moved unseen, who destroyed convoys and patrols with terrifying precision. Fear spread quicker than orders, and she knew fear was the second fracture. Yet she also knew her time was limited. The warlord who ruled the iron nest would not sit idle forever. He would send hunters, men trained differently than the raiders she had faced, men who lived for blood and silence as she did. On the 7th night, as she returned to her vantage point overlooking the fortress, she found her instincts proven. Across the ridge opposite her position she saw the faint glint of glass, another scope, watching, searching. She dropped flat instantly, her body pressed into the earth as a bullet snapped past, kicking dirt where her head had been. The hunters had arrived. She crawled backward, careful, every inch a battle against the urge to run. Another shot rang out, grazing stone near her shoulder. She rolled behind a rock, steadied her breath, and listened. They were good, too good to be common raiders. She had expected this, and yet the reality still pressed against her chest with weight. Slowly she peeked through her scope, scanning the ridges, and caught sight of one crouched figure moving with professional precision. She fired, and the figure dropped, but she knew there would be more. The warlord had likely sent a team, and they would not stop until she was ended. The night became a deadly chess match across the ridges, shots cracking, echoes rolling, shadows shifting. She moved constantly, never staying in one place, her rifle an extension of her will as she answered each attempt with cold precision. 2 more fell before the night ended, their bodies sprawled against the rocks, but when dawn came she knew at least one remained. The hunt was no longer one-sided. She had become the hunted as well. She retreated deeper into the desert, her mind sharper than ever, knowing this was the turning point. The warlord was aware of her now, not as rumor but as threat, and he would marshal everything against her. She studied the documents again by the dim light of morning, tracing the supply lines that still remained, the routes she had not yet severed. She resolved to keep cutting, keep burning, keep striking until the iron nest bled itself into weakness. Yet even as she hardened her resolve, she could feel the presence of the unseen hunter still trailing her, patient, waiting for her mistake. For the first time in years a flicker of something passed through her chest, not fear but the recognition of a worthy enemy. She tightened the strap of her pack, checked the rifle, and whispered into the desert air words she had not spoken in a long time. Let him come. As the battle wore on, Maria felt her body ache under the strain of constant motion. Her arms trembled from the recoil of the M2010, her shoulders bruised by the repeated shock of its fire, yet she refused to let weakness break her resolve. The enemy had regrouped, pressing harder with drones, artillery, and a renewed wave of infantry, but Maria adjusted, breathing in rhythm with the pulse of her scope. Each shot cracked like thunder, and every time she pulled the trigger, another soldier fell before they even realized where death had come from. The villagers watching from hidden shelters had begun whispering her name as though it were legend, murmurs of awe mixing with prayers of gratitude, because Maria had become their shield when no one else had dared to stand. Even her allies from the militia began to follow her lead, timing their moves with the lull of her cover fire, advancing when she cleared the way, retreating when she signaled danger, and soon the skirmish took on a rhythm where Maria's rifle was the heartbeat that kept them alive. But the enemy realized she was the center of resistance, and their commanders turned all focus toward ending her defiance, sending snipers, spotters, and even air support into the valley to pin her down. Explosions shook the earth around her as mortars struck near her perch, shattering rocks and sending dust into her eyes, but she held her position, teeth clenched, chest heaving with stubborn fury, because she knew if she fell, everything behind her would collapse. When one enemy sniper finally caught her outline, she felt the brush of a bullet pass so close it singed her ear, and instinctively she dropped, rolling across the dirt, reloading with mechanical speed, her heart pounding like a war drum. She shifted to a secondary position, camouflaging herself with mud and torn fabric, lying as still as a corpse until her enemy revealed his position with a glint of scope light, and then she exhaled slowly and fired, her shot cutting through the silence with finality. The sniper fell, and Maria whispered to herself, "Not today." Yet the pressure grew worse. Helicopters roared in the sky, unleashing torrents of gunfire that shredded trees and tore the ground apart. Villagers screamed, children cried, and even the militia began to falter, but Maria steadied them with her defiance. She called out instructions, her voice hoarse but commanding, telling them where to take cover, when to move, and which targets to strike, her simple presence turning fear into determination. With the M2010 in her hands, she made the impossible possible, piercing through armored glass of a chopper cockpit with a single, perfect shot, sending the machine spiraling in flames into the hillside. The explosion lit the night sky, and for a moment the militia cheered, their faith in her now absolute, their morale stronger than ever. But Maria knew the fight wasn't over. The enemy was relentless, their numbers endless, their resolve fueled by orders and cruelty rather than courage. She thought of her family, of her late husband who had once held the same rifle with steady hands, of the promise she had made to herself that no invader would ever take her home without paying a price in blood, and her eyes hardened with fire. Sweat rolled down her brow, mixing with the grime of battle, but she kept firing, every shot measured, every bullet a statement that she would not yield. When ammunition began to run low, she rationed each round with precision, using the rifle only for the most critical threats, while signaling militia fighters to pick up the slack with captured enemy weapons. Her leadership grew, not from authority but from sacrifice, and the men and women around her began to move with courage they never thought they had. The night dragged into dawn, and still Maria fought, her rifle echoing like a hymn of defiance across the valley, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun, unbroken, unyielding, and unforgettable. By the time reinforcements finally arrived, answering the desperate calls of the village, they found not a place of despair but a battlefield already carved into legend, where a simple woman with nothing but determination and an M2010 had turned back the tide. She did not raise her hands in victory, nor did she celebrate, because in her mind the fight was never about glory, it was about survival, about love for the land she called home, about the faces of the people who had no one else to protect them. And as the smoke cleared, Maria knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning, because now the world would come to know her name, and those who underestimated her would never make that mistake again. The forest lay in eerie silence after the smoke of battle cleared, and Evelyn stood amidst the wreckage, her hands still tight around the grip of the M2010, breath shallow yet steady as her senses remained sharp for any sound of movement. The air smelled of gunpowder, burned earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood, a grim reminder of the chaos she had just survived, but she did not allow herself the comfort of relief, for she knew well enough that battles did not end when the last gunshot rang. They ended when the enemy accepted defeat, and she could not be certain this one had done so. She moved quietly, almost like a hunter, her boots pressing carefully against the soil as her eyes scanned the ruined camp, every overturned crate and shattered tent a potential hiding place for survivors waiting to ambush her, and though her body screamed with fatigue, her mind was sharpened by instinct and the quiet fury of determination, for she had not fought only to kill, she had fought to prove she was not a woman to be dismissed. In the shadows of a collapsed wall, she spotted movement, the subtle shift of cloth against stone, and she swung the rifle into position with flawless precision, her cheek pressed against the stock, finger steady on the trigger, ready to release one final round, but as her eye focused through the scope, she saw not a soldier but a boy, trembling and wide-eyed, clutching a broken pistol in hands that the weapon might as well have been a toy. For a brief moment, time held still, and Evelyn felt the war within herself, the hardened resolve of a fighter colliding with the compassion of a woman who still carried humanity in her heart. And though the boy's uniform bore the same insignia as the enemies who had tried to kill her, she could not bring herself to squeeze the trigger, instead lowering the rifle slowly, whispering in a voice firm yet not unkind, "Go home." The boy's eyes widened in confusion, then fear, and without a word he dropped the pistol and stumbled away into the forest, vanishing into the darkness like a frightened animal, leaving Evelyn alone once more, surrounded by the ghosts of the fallen and the echo of her own conscience. She knew that sparing him might mean trouble later, that mercy often carried a price, but she accepted it, because she had already shattered expectations by fighting with a rifle most thought too powerful for someone like her, and she would continue shattering them by proving strength was not only measured by the bodies left behind, but also by the restraint one chose in moments of impossible decisions. With the camp secure, she slung the M2010 across her back and began her long trek home, though home was no longer the same quiet cabin it had once been. With others would come, drawn by the tale of the simple woman who picked up a sniper's weapon and turned the tide of a fight she was never meant to win. Days later, when she returned to her small village, the people looked at her differently, no longer seeing the quiet widow who tended her garden in solitude, but the warrior who stood against mercenaries and survived. And though some feared her, most found hope in her presence, for in her they saw proof that even the most unassuming soul could rise when pressed against the wall of fate. Yet Evelyn herself felt no triumph, only a quiet, lingering restlessness, a knowledge that the world beyond her village had marked her name, and that whispers of her defiance would travel faster than she could hide. She had unleashed a storm that could not be contained, and though she longed for peace, she knew it would not come easily. The M2010 rested in her cabin now, leaning against the wall near the door like a silent sentinel, its presence both comfort and warning, and every time her eyes fell upon it she remembered the recoil against her shoulder, the sound of bullets cracking through the air, and the silence of men who underestimated her, silenced forever by the shot they never expected. She was no longer just Evelyn the simple woman, she was Evelyn the sharpshooter, Evelyn the survivor, Evelyn the name carried on the tongues of enemies who feared what one determined soul could do when armed with skill, willpower, and an unyielding heart. And though she had walked back into the quiet life she once knew, she carried the certainty that it would not be long before she was called upon again, for the world had a way of testing those who had proven themselves capable, and when that test came she would not hesitate, for she had already learned what she was, and she would never again allow anyone to tell her she was too weak, too fragile, or too ordinary to fight. For she had picked up the M2010 once, and in that moment she had shattered every expectation, rewriting not just her story, but the story of anyone who would dare to doubt her again. The end.